sobre matrimonio infantil temprano y forzado en las Américas. Antes de comenzar, quisiera agradecer a la Comisión Interamericana de Mujeres y a la OEA por haber invitado a Plan International, Oficina Regional, Oficina de Plan Guatemala, a ser parte de este espacio que para Plan International es un espacio extremadamente estratégico, clave, y que esperemos realmente que salgamos con una coordinación más estrecha entre las organizaciones que estamos aquí sentadas y sentados. Para mí es un honor compartir esta mesa con las siguientes panelistas que representan organizaciones diversas, con estrategias y respuestas programáticas y de incidencia política diversas. Así que vamos a comenzar. Ya sabemos que tenemos en el librito que nos han entregado la biografía de cada una de ellas, por lo cual no me detendré a introducirlas. Comenzaremos por Shelly Abdul, de UNICEF. Shelly, ¿cómo estás? Nos gustaría saber cómo se manifiesta el matrimonio y unión infantil en las Américas. ¿Cuáles son las similitudes y las diferencias con otras regiones?
Thank you very much, Emma, and good morning to all of you. I'd also like to take the opportunity to send greetings from our regional director, Marita Perceval, who is our very first female director for the regional office of Latin America and the Caribbean of UNICEF, and also from the region. She would have very much liked to be here with us today. Unfortunately, she is in another engagement in Panama. In response to the first question that Emma is giving me, the panel that preceded us has already laid out some of the very clear drivers and ways that child marriage is playing out within the region. I think that what I'd like to add to those, and to respond to the second part of the question in terms of similarities and differences, perhaps with other regions. One thing that strikes me is that, and Heather mentioned this, is that we seem to have an idea of what the drivers are, the intersections between sexual violence, the intersections with adolescent pregnancy, and the overall driver of gender inequality in the region with respect to child marriage. But there seems to be differences in the numbers we have. And while the numbers we have might seem like something really boring, without having a common approach to numbers and measurements, and whether we're looking at girls married before the age of 15 or girls married between the age of 15 to 18, it's difficult for us to develop coherent institutional responses amongst the range of actors that are here and the range of actors that are represented within the OAS. So I think that in terms of trying to respond coherently and how does it manifest, I think it depends on what data source we use, and that is worrying for UNICEF, because if the magnitude depends on data source, then we continue to have silence about how important this issue is in the region. And the table that Heather showed, where countries from this region do show up on globally high prevalence countries, yet there's a general ignorance of what the true magnitude and how deep-rooted child marriage is in the region. And so what may happen is that we end up going at it from separate entry points or separate tracks, which might be okay, but we've learned from the area of preventing sexual and gender-based violence that a common front and common approaches also helps to garner stronger results. There are differences in terms of how child marriage is playing out through the different sub-regions. So we see different patterns in the Caribbean, we see different patterns in Central America, and different patterns in South America, which also means that a one-size-fits-all response will not work. We need to take into consideration sub-regional realities and sub-regional contexts and actors in order to make an impact in reducing towards eliminating child marriage. Many people have already spoken about the connections or the complex relationship between adolescent pregnancy and sexual violence, both as either drivers or consequences of child marriage. I think that the persistence of gender inequalities that underlines all three of these practices, as was just in October in Montevideo at the Regional Women's Conference, underlined that women and girls continue to face in this region persistent inequalities, both in areas of political autonomy, economic autonomy, and physical autonomy or physical integrity. And 40 years of a review of looking at the regional gender agenda, while there are many advances in terms of our legal and policy frameworks, we're seeing little advances in indicators such as sexual violence, child marriage, and adolescent pregnancy. We know that adolescent pregnancy, we have the second highest adolescent pregnancy rate in the world, followed only by sub-Saharan Africa. Our child marriage prevalence, while it may not be as high as it is in other regions, has not significantly declined in the past 30 years. This, to us in UNICEF, represents that it's a silent alarm. Because it's not necessarily at the highest levels globally, it seems like maybe it's not the priority we need to focus on. But an indicator that does not decrease in 30 years means that we're not investing enough to reduce it and finally reach the targets that is now included in SDG 5. And I think that for me, in terms of the second part of the question that Emma asked me, in terms of differences with other regions, I think that the overall public debate on child marriage doesn't seem to be at the same intensity as it is in other regions. And maybe because we've allowed ourselves to say, it's an okay prevalence, it's not so bad. Maybe because the underlying gender norms and gender inequalities are so strong that it's acceptable that being married before the age of 18, being married before the age of 15, being a mother to more than one child before the age of 18 is an acceptable life project for young girls. And not only is it accepted by them, it's accepted and endorsed by their families and their communities. So maybe where our silence is, to me, the silence is resounding in terms of that difference with other regions. And it's a real pleasure and honor to be here with a group of people who, it seems to me, we're ready to break that silence. And we're ready to say, it's not okay that we have a lower prevalence than other regions. It's not okay that that prevalence is not reduced in the past 30 years. And it's not okay that we have not invested enough in making feasible alternative life projects available to young girls. So that for me is how I would see some of the differences with other regions.
Gracias, Shelley. En este escenario al que tú te refieres, que tiene diferencias, especificidades sociales y culturales muy diversas según las regiones de América Latina y de Caribe, y en este contexto al que tú te refieres como alarma silenciosa, donde la igualdad de género está en el centro del trabajo al cual nos tenemos que unir, ¿cuál es la propuesta de UNICEF para proteger a las niñas contra el matrimonio y la unión infantil en las Américas?
The UNICEF at a global level, and we operate at 3 levels, globally, regionally, and nationally. At a global level, UNICEF co-chairs with UNFPA and many actors on this panel a global program to end child marriage. Unfortunately, the 12 countries included in that global program do not include any from Latin America and the Caribbean. So at a regional level, that means that our office based in Panama is trying to work with other partners to determine how do we contextualize, if needed, that global program and ensure that countries in this region have access to the knowledge being generated from it and also the partnerships around it. Specifically in 2015, within the Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Interagency Working Group amongst the agencies of the United Nations, we launched, and this was signed and launched by the directors, regional directors of all of the agencies, a flagship initiative around child marriage, and the 5 agencies involved include UNICEF, UNFPA, UN Women, UNAIDS, and the Pan American Health Organization. And the idea for this initial, very humble flagship initiative was to join forces, to not compete for resources, and to support countries in order to change the age of marriage to the age according to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and where the age of 18 has already been established to remove all legal exceptions from within their legal framework. When we discussed this with the other agencies, we were very conscious that legal reforms is but one entry point. It's one part of an overall package of interventions that is required to end child marriage. And all of the speakers in the previous panel referred to some of those different interventions that need to happen. So this year, with the same 5 agencies, and in particular coordinated between UNICEF, UN Women, and UNFPA, we are attempting to convert this very modest flagship initiative in a broader joint program that will address the underlying drivers and the range of different structural factors that are leaving us in this silence on child marriage, specifically looking at the interactions between child marriage, adolescent pregnancy, and sexual violence. It is not a joint program that we hope stays within the United Nations. The agencies, the idea of this joint program is to try to create a platform that would involve a range of partners that we will be able to better support in a coordinated way across agencies and actors that have a similar mandate and a similar preoccupation for child marriage in order to support countries in what in their goals around child marriage. In particular, the focus of the draft joint program that is underway, beyond looking at the aspects of legal reforms, includes the necessity to include multi-sectoral and multi-level strategies, to look at the complex relation between the drivers of child marriage that sometimes are consequences and other times are their drivers. Looking specifically at the area of social norms change that was mentioned today in terms of at the family and household level and community level, but also looking at what sort of systemic changes are required. It's one thing for us to change norms and beliefs around what is acceptable for young girls and for young boys, but if we don't have a systemic response that can actually sustain what we want in terms of gender equality, then we're still doing our work only partially. And one of the examples that I'd like to share on that is around the issue of education. We often hear also that we don't need to worry about girls' education in this region because if we just compare the brute numbers, we have more girls completing school, we have more girls completing school with better results, and the overall number of out-of-school children who are boys is much higher than numbers of out-of-school girls. And while we can question those numbers in terms of being national numbers and not looking at within country differences that happen based on area of residence, based on ethnic group, the challenge with that figure as one that we use for a success we have in gender equality in the region is that, unfortunately, that higher performance and higher completion rates for girls has not translated into better economic opportunities, nor more stable economic opportunities. So if we address a driver of child marriage with respect to education, and in particular transition to secondary education, but we haven't resolved the issue of the Better Life Project because we're still going to put them in unstable employment conditions, then we're still only doing it halfway. So part of the proposal within this joint platform that we would like to propose is to not only address the norms change, but also the systemic changes that need to happen. Another key component is recognizing girls as agents of change and in creating meaningful spaces for their participation and listening to them in terms of where and how we need to move the needle with respect to gender equality according to their definitions and perceptions, and not using a model that perhaps they don't see themselves within. And finally, ensuring that there is an opportunity for exchange between countries, that this learning that happens between countries and with other regions is really much more meaningful than having a one-off workshop where many of us speak to one another, but really it's engaging with what works in terms of overcoming the phenomenal obstacles we have to gender equality in the region. And those obstacles continue to grow on a daily basis, especially with respect to sexual and reproductive rights of young girls. So this, the platform intends to also include a good opportunity for country-to-country learning, and also knowing that the child marriage is an issue in other regions, trying to foster where we could have learnings from other regions that would be relevant to this region. Finally, I would like to add that the issue of information and the issue of having coherent and comparable and consolidated or harmonized information is critical, but it's even more critical for girls aged 10 to 14. If we have a silent alarm on child marriage, we know even less, there's even higher statistical silence on girls 10 to 14, particularly around the drivers of child marriage. And if we want to use the 10-year-old girl as our flag bearer for how we will achieve our SDGs, we need to know much more about her. And we need to know what is happening in her life, what obstacles is she facing, what opportunities does she have in order for us to truly achieve the SDGs, but also ensure that she has the best opportunity to achieve and fulfill the life project that she defines in a society that considers that she has the right to define that. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Shelley. Sin lugar a dudas, esfuerzos como los que está realizando UNICEF junto con otras agencias de Naciones Unidas en ese ánimo de generar espacios de coordinación para trabajar en esta cuestión que nos reúne hoy a todos y a todas es realmente súper importante y nos anima a las organizaciones que estamos presentes a tomar estas iniciativas como espacios en los que podemos contribuir. Desde luego, temas muy importantes que nos destaca Shelley en relación al trabajo que está desarrollando UNICEF en la región, en el cual pone de manifiesto la necesidad de recordar que la igualdad de género está en el centro de nuestra respuesta para proteger a las niñas como agentes, niñas empoderadas y que puedan contribuir al cambio. Un tema sumamente importante y que hablaremos durante la discusión más adelante es la importancia de recordar las niñas menores de 15 años, el ciclo de vida entre 10 a 14 años. Esto también, Shelley, es sumamente importante y del cual esperemos que podamos conversar más adelante. Estos espacios de trabajo conjunto nos han reunido también en otras instancias, en otros países, a trabajar las organizaciones que estamos aquí presentes. Recordemos el trabajo que se hizo en Guatemala con muchas de las organizaciones que estáis aquí sentadas en el marco de la Mesa por los Derechos de las Niñas, que con el apoyo también de la diputada Trujillo se logró elevar la edad de matrimonio a 18 años. Y en este sentido, quisiera que esto fuera un tema que pudiéramos conversar y que nos pudiera dar más información Paula Tavares. Y en este sentido te preguntaría, Paula, ¿cuáles son las principales brechas legislativas en términos de matrimonio infantil en las Américas? ¿Crees que la ley es discriminatoria contra las niñas?
Well, thank you. I first wanted to thank the organizers and the OAS for inviting me to be here, but most importantly for having an event on such an important issue, critical issue for girls and women around the world and in the Americas. To give you a little bit of background, I work on a project at the World Bank called Women, Business, and the Law, which looks at gaps in legislation to achieving gender equality. And within that realm, I'll give you a little bit of the data that we produce and some of the areas that we look at affecting child marriage. When we look at legislation on age of marriage for girls and boys, it's interesting to note that in all the economies in Latin America and the Caribbean that we look at, the age of marriage for girls and for boys is 18 or higher, and that's quite positive news. It's also positive to note that in all the economies and countries, the age of marriage for girls and boys is the same. That's quite different from the global picture. We just published a topic note called Closing the Gap, Improving Laws Protecting Women from Violence, where we specifically highlight the regional and global gaps in legislation addressing child marriage. One of our key findings is the age of marriage established by law for girls is under 18 still in 11 economies, where that's the case only in 4 economies for boys. And that in 17 economies, the legal age of marriage for boys and girls is different. And where that is the case, it's invariably true that girls can be married at a younger age. In Mali, for example, boys can legally be married at 18, while girls can be married at 16. And there are places where the age of marriage for girls is even lower by law. It's 15 or under, or sometimes not clearly defined. In Kuwait, for example, the age of marriage for girls is 15. In Iran, girls can be married when they turn 13. And I bring some of these examples from around the globe to highlight the fact that at least in terms of setting the legal age for marriage, countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have achieved good progress. However, one of the main issues that we find when we look at legislation around the world, and this has been already mentioned here by several of the speakers, is that even where legislation sets the age of marriage for girls at 18 or over, most countries, and that includes almost all in Latin America and the Caribbean, have exceptions, allowing girls to be married earlier with parental consent, court authorization, or in the case of pregnancy. That's actually the case globally in 3 out of 4 economies, and again, in almost all the economies in Latin America, the Caribbean. This means that girls can become child brides if their parents so decide, and that girls may have very little to say, if any, about when they marry. In El Salvador, for example, the legal age of marriage is 18, but a girl can be married at 12 with her parents' consent. In Ecuador, this was also the case until just last year. The Civil Code of Argentina establishes the age of marriage for girls at 18, but also specifically states that courts can authorize marriage at an earlier age. And similarly, as we all know, in several states in the United States, the age of marriage for girls is 18, but girls can be married as early as 14 with parental consent and court authorization. And what we've learned is that where the legal age of marriage for girls is 18 or above, more girls are enrolled in secondary education. This has already been mentioned here. But also, consequently, the adverse effect is that lower education rates for girls due to child marriage can also affect their capacity to get jobs later on in life. So these are some of the main outcomes just in terms of kind of results for women and girls based on the legal age of marriage established by law. Another aspect that we look at is whether the law provides and allows for the annulment of marriages when one of the spouses is under the legal age. And what we found is that in many countries, once a girl is married, it's very difficult for her to leave the marriage. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, the legal age of marriage for girls is 18, but a girl can be married at any age with her parents' consent, and there are no legal grounds for invalidating child marriages. The somewhat good news for Latin America is that only about 10% of the economies still don't either explicitly prohibit marriage under the legal age or allow for the annulment. But globally, this number rises to about 20% of the countries that we look at. And then it's interesting to note that some countries actually have measures in place just to protect girls who are married. In Panama, for example, the law protects the assets of girls who are married, children who are married, until they reach the age of 18. In terms of other measures that can help curb child marriage that we look at, legislation in many countries establishes some form of sanction, generally fine or imprisonment, for those who perform, authorize, or knowingly enter into child marriage or marriage in violation of the age requirements. And these provisions exist in about 2/3 of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. In Uruguay, for example, according to the criminal code, an officer who celebrates a marriage in violation of the age requirement is subject to imprisonment from 3 to 24 months and can be suspended from office from 2 to 6 years. However, the sad fact is that despite these measures, we know that child marriage is still quite prevalent in the Americas, often a result of social norms, as has been mentioned here. It's rooted in gender discrimination, but is also many times seen as a solution for poverty, for families who think that by marrying off their girls early, they can relieve themselves from economic burden. And so the gaps still existing in legislation that I've highlighted, that have been highlighted here before, but also the failure to enforce measures that do exist that are protective of girls in the different laws in countries still show and result in discrimination against girls that I believe we need to address very strongly.
Muchas gracias, Paula. Efectivamente, es sumamente importante lo que destacas en este contexto de alta prevalencia, con normas sociales que contribuyen al matrimonio infantil, donde el matrimonio se identifica como una vía de escape a la pobreza vinculada a la desigualdad de género. Todavía tenemos mucho trabajo que seguir adelante para eliminar las causales, a pesar de que, como decía Paula, hay grandes avances a nivel legislativo en la América Latina y el Caribe, porque la edad de matrimonio es a partir de los 18 años. En este sentido, Paula, me gustaría también que nos hablaras de cuáles son las brechas entre el derecho internacional y la ley y la política a nivel nacional.
Well, thank you. While there are still major gaps, as I've pointed out just in the last few minutes, still existing around the world, it's also important to highlight the progress in legislation and policy that is being made both at the international and domestic levels around the world. There's now consensus, as we've heard here, that child is a person below the age of 18. But that was not always the case. If we go back in history, child marriage was not only legal, but common practice around the world, not only for girls, but for boys. More recently, with regional and international instruments, such as the Convention on Consent to Marriage, Minimum Age for Marriage and Registration of Marriages, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as various regional instruments that have been put in place, the international movement has paved the way for commitments by countries and set new standards for marriage legislation. The CRC, again, defines a child as anyone under the age of 18 unless a lower age is established as majority by the law. And CEDAW calls for legislation against child marriage. And in 2015, as we've heard here, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a substantive resolution against child marriage. An explicit target under Goal 5 in the new Sustainable Development Agenda calls for the elimination of all harmful practices, including child, early, and forced marriage. With these standards set, child marriage is now considered a violation of human rights, and as such, countries have been reforming their laws to comply with international human rights standards. As I mentioned earlier, one of the key gaps is that there are still 15 economies around the world where the legal age of marriage for girls is either under 18 or not clearly defined, and many, many others where, even though it is above 18, there are gaps and loopholes in the legislation which allow them to be married earlier with consent authorization in the case of pregnancy. The good news, and that's what I wanted to highlight a bit here, is that while there's still a ways to go, progress has been made over the past few years in domestic legislation. One of the challenges, really, is that family law, or the equivalent legislation around the world that addresses rules on marriage, is considered one of the hardest to reform, mainly because it touches upon norms that affect the private sphere of life. However, Women Business in the Law has tracked a number of reforms in the past couple of years addressing this issue. For example, the new Family Code of Nicaragua raised the minimum age of marriage for boys and girls from 14 to 16. And an amendment to the Civil Code of Uruguay raised the minimum age of marriage with parental consent for boys and girls to 16 from previously 14 and 12, respectively. Other regions of the world, we've also seen changes to the legislation increasing age of marriage for girls. This includes Kenya and Luxembourg. And more recently, just last year, Guatemala approved a reform to the Civil Code to establish that boys and girls can only get married at the age of majority and raise the age of marriage with judicial consent to 16. And also, as mentioned before, Ecuador removed a provision that previously allowed girls to be married at 12 with parental consent and now considers that any marriage under the age of 18 is invalid. And as we've heard here from the representative of Panama, also, the Family Code has just been reformed last year to prohibit the marriage of persons under the age of 18. So it's, I think, heartening to see that, yes, we still have many gaps to fill, especially in terms of the legislation, and definitely more so in terms of the practice and the enforcement of these laws and changing social norms, cultural norms, and how these issues are viewed around the world. But I think the good news is that progress is being made. It's being made even in the last few years, in the last couple of years, and hopefully much more progress will be seen in the next couple of years, especially based on actions and initiatives such as this one and the ones that all the panelists around the table and all of you are undertaking around the world. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Paula, que nos recuerda en este escenario de la Agenda de Desarrollo Sostenible la necesidad de identificar y revisar los mecanismos y las convenciones que existen actualmente y que nos pueden contribuir a poder posicionar y contribuir a la eliminación del matrimonio infantil. Existen desafíos todavía en relación a los códigos de la familia en algunos de los países de la región, pero Paula es optimista en que realmente ha habido avances y progresos y no podemos dejar de lado esta cuestión que es sumamente importante y que esperemos que podamos retomarla en el trabajo de coordinación entre las organizaciones que aquí estamos sentadas y sentados. Después de Paula, me gustaría cederle la palabra a Gabriela Hossein, que nos va a llevar hasta el Caribe anglófono. Nos gustaría saber un poquito más sobre esa región de Caribe y que nos contaras cómo se manifiesta el matrimonio y la unión infantil en el Caribe anglófono y que nos contaras también si esto es un problema generalizado o se limita a ciertos grupos étnicos o religiosos. Gabriel tiene un PowerPoint.
Buenos días.
Que pueden mirar mientras ella lo cuenta.
Buenos días. I'd like to thank the OAS and SIM for inviting me here. Now, speaking from Trinidad and Tobago, there's a number of things that I'd like to say. I need to be able to move the PowerPoint.
This might be it.
Yeah. No, this is the...
That's the side. Something to move the
yeah, I need to move the PowerPoint.
¿Alguien nos puede ayudar para mover el PowerPoint, por favor? ¿Hay algún...?
Okay, while that's happening, I'm going to be speaking today in terms of girls' vulnerability, in terms of 4 kinds of indicators that we need to see as interconnected. One is, of course, child marriage, but the other ones are teenage pregnancy, teenage abortion, child sexual abuse and incest, and HIV. I need to be able to change the slides. Sorry?
You need to change slides. ¿Alguien puede ayudarnos para pasar las diapositivas, por favor?
Is it down there? It might be down there. Muchas gracias. Right. Okay. Now, in Trinidad and Tobago, there are 4 marriage acts. This speaks to the multicultural nature of the society. We're a complex society in which the Hindu Marriage Act allows a girl to be married at 14 and a boy at 18. The Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act allows a girl to marry at 12 and a boy at 16. The Orisha Marriage Act allows for marriages as early as 16, and the national, what's called the Marriage Act of Trinidad and Tobago, under which Christian and civil marriages take place, actually specifies no minimum marriageable age. Indeed, you'll see that children are married under all three acts, excluding the Orisha Act. For example, over the past decade in Trinidad and Tobago, there have been 548 child marriages. This is much higher than was originally expected in the society. And under the Civil Act, there were 117 marriages. Under the Hindu Marriage Act, 328. And under the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act, 103. This is very important for not treating this as an ethnic concern specific to some religious groups, such as Hindus and Muslims, or indeed only as concerning, say, Indo-Trinidadians rather than others. It speaks to its national importance. Now, I'm just going to run through a couple of important numbers, which is to say that although this is not affecting girls who are 12 or 13 in wide numbers, we can say that each number is an important case of the denial of girls' development and rights. However, we do need to keep in mind, for example, that in 2010, 17 13-year-olds and 9 14-year-olds were married in Trinidad and Tobago. And between 2016 and now, 2015, one 13-year-old and one 14-year-old were married. Same in 2014, 2015, 2014, 2013, two 13-year-olds and four 14-year-olds were married. Now, what's important for us to keep in mind is not just the numbers, but the context within which child marriage is taking place. A lot of this is going to change with the introduction of the Miscellaneous Provisions Marriage Bill, which is currently in front of the Trinidad and Tobago Cabinet. This bill is going to raise the age of marriage to 18, in harmony with what's called the Children's Act of 2012, which specifies the age of sexual consent to be 18, with clauses for adolescent sexual activity between 16 and 18, as long as they are occurring between adolescents. So it's quite progressive in terms of decriminalizing same age sexuality among adolescents, but trying to target girls' greater vulnerability. Now, it's important for us to keep in mind that when we look at these kinds of numbers, they also highlight to us some of the risks of changing the law. For example, the Family Planning Association of Trinidad and Tobago has highlighted that this legal change is going to make it harder for adolescents to access medical services and indeed may stigmatize the offering of medical services. So, for example, the Family Planning Association has suggested putting into law 16 as the age of consent to medical service. Another important consideration is that this legal change is going to not be received by all sectors of the society because of the symbolic ethnic importance of these marriage laws. For example, the Hindu Women's Organization has argued that, again, marriage should be able to occur at age 16 with the consent of child parents or guardians. There is not a harmonious or indeed consensual approach to this issue in Trinidad and Tobago because a lot of communities are concerned with avoiding unwed sex as a matter of respectability politics. However, I think it's very important that we really put the question of predatory masculinity on the table in as forceful a language as need to be said, because what we are describing are not adolescent sexual encounters, but encounters in which young girls are vulnerable to adult predators, adult male predators, and that's where we need to begin. While we're dealing with girls' empowerment, we also need to take into account that this is the context that we also need to collectively change. For example, in terms of teenage pregnancies, between 2008 and 2015, there were 35 pregnancies to girls under 12 years old, and there were 2,645 pregnancies for girls 13 to 16 years old, and 12,000 pregnancies to girls 17 to 19 years old. This is in a situation where the unemployment rate amongst girls is much higher than the unemployment rate amongst boys of that age, number one. but also where we continue to see how vulnerability will go on to affect their ability to sustain themselves on multiple levels. And this is a quote from the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago, who said the actual birth certificates showed that some of the girls between 13 and 14 years old were mothers to children of fathers who were between the ages of 16 to 40 years. In these statistics, we have recorded the actual live births of thousands of children in circumstances potentially equal to statutory rape. In fact, that this has happened is rape. I want to just very quickly highlight, we're not just talking about child marriage. I've also highlighted the case of child pregnancies. I also want to highlight the case of sexual offenses against girls. So for example, whereas between 2000 and 2015, there were 2 cases of charges of sex with males under 16 years old. In 2014 alone, there were 152 cases of sex with females between 14 to 16 years, and 93 these are charges that are registered charges with the police. 93 cases of charges for sex with females under 14 years old. I want to also highlight that these numbers are rising. So for example, although it was 44 cases in 2000, it rose to 81 in 2007 and indeed rose to 152 in 2014. So that in the last 15 years, there have been over 2,000 matters of sexual offenses in relation to girls. Now, the importance of this indeed places the low numbers around child marriage, although there are 548, in the context of a much larger set of numbers around girls' adolescent sexual vulnerability, indeed to situations where there is forced sex, non-consensual sex, and an ability to negotiate their sexual autonomy and indeed their lives. And so I've also continued to list, as of July 2015, the cases of charges for sexual intercourse with a female under the age of 14, almost 559. Finally, I want to point out that between 2011 and 2015, there were abortions that were performed in the public hospitals for 67 13 to 16-year-olds and 683 17 to 19-year-olds in a country where abortion remains largely considered illegal. So these are cases that end up in the public hospitals, not cases that have been successfully and safely, not terminations, that were successful and safe in private care. And the child sexual abuse data, again, suggests that 86% of child sexual abuse cases comprise girls, and that this, I think, is the beginnings of what comes to later be understood as child marriage, right? The instances of girls' greater vulnerability to child sexual abuse. Finally, of course, I think it necessary to highlight the question of HIV. HIV has always affected girls more greatly than boys. In the chart you're seeing, the red represents girls, 15 to 24. The blue represents boys, 15 to 24. And I would like to add that girls accounted for 60% of all new infections in 2014. Finally, and this is my, oh gosh, my slides, I've been missing you all with the slides. Finally, I want to return to the question not so much of child and forced marriage, as much as the question of girls' vulnerability to early forced sex, to early sexual initiation, the fact that minors, when they are girls, but when they are teens, are not considered children. So teens, although they are minors, are not considered children. After they hit a certain age, they are considered to be valid for marriage and adult male sexual access. Consent remains an issue in Trinidad and Tobago. And I just want to get to the final slide that I want to leave you with, which is that, oh gosh, here, which is that there is fundamentally no national sexual and reproductive health policy. And I think these are the numbers here, where you can see that adolescent girls' rates of HIV infection are much higher than the rates of adolescent boys. HIV infection. And indeed, I think this is the final message that we should be discussing as we leave here today. How are we going to deal with the child sexual abuse rates of girls that translate into early childhood marriage rates, that translate into early HIV, early pregnancy, early sexual assault, and early abortion? All of them have to be seen as interconnected, and I would argue that unless we very strongly put the questions of predatory masculinity and how that becomes contained and curtailed and prosecuted on the table, we will not be effectively able to empower girls, even if we are able to go far. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Gabriele, que realmente nos pone un escenario sumamente preocupante en el Caribe anglófono, en el que nos destaca la necesidad de analizar el contexto en donde las cifras de abuso sexual hacia las niñas son altamente elevadas, que esos abusos sexuales no pueden ser desvinculados de los embarazos tempranos forzados y, evidentemente, estrechamente vinculado con la problemática de matrimonio infantil o matrimonio forzado de niñas, que en el contexto que ella nos relata define un escenario en donde vemos altas tasas de abortos no seguros en los hospitales públicos y acompañado de una impunidad estrecha y grande que no contribuye a la situación de las niñas. Nos trae de manifiesto la importancia de recordar que no podemos perder de vista la vulnerabilidad a la que están expuestas las niñas del Caribe anglófono, pero también podríamos decir por lo que han expuesto las compañeras de América Latina y los otros Caribes. También nos trae de manifiesto la importancia de recordar que vivimos en espacios multiculturales donde cohabitan diferentes prácticas culturales y sociales tradicionales. Ella hablaba del contexto hindú, el contexto musulmán, el contexto oricha. Estos contextos los evidenciamos en todos los países de América Latina y el Caribe, y la necesidad de tener respuestas específicas que respondan a una negociación con esos espacios culturales que ella define como espacios multiculturales. Otro tema sumamente importante que nos trae Gabriel y que nos tiene que servir para la discusión es el concepto de masculinidad predatoria, como ella lo define, donde el perpetrador es siempre un hombre adulto que abusa sexualmente de las niñas. Y definitivamente muchas de las organizaciones que estamos aquí sentadas somos conscientes de la necesidad de trabajar por las masculinidades positivas, y así lo estamos haciendo paralelamente del trabajo en general espacios de empoderamiento de las niñas. Eso sabemos que hay que hacerlo de la mano, y Gabriel realmente pone el acento sobre este contexto de hombres adultos. Pero ¿qué hacemos? Yo diría, como lanzo para más adelante, con los niños en las tempranas edades para modificar esto. Los datos, como decíamos, son sumamente preocupantes. Identificamos realmente que la edad de matrimonio en estos países puede ser mucho más temprana. Y definitivamente no podemos perder de vista todo lo que está relacionado con la vulnerabilidad de los cuerpos de las niñas y la ausencia de posibilitar que sean autónomas frente a las decisiones de su vida. Muchas gracias, Giovanna. Seguimos adelante con nuestra compañera Jan Snot. Jan Snot, nos gustaría que nos contaras cómo se manifiesta el matrimonio infantil y forzado en los Estados Unidos, a cuáles comunidades afecta y qué tan prevalente es.
Thank you very much. I want to first express my appreciation to the Organization of American States and to all of you here for providing this important forum. And I also wanted to say at the outset that I encourage and applaud the U.S. government for steps it takes towards addressing this problem globally, and I welcome additional steps, but also to note that the U.S.'s moral authority to lead globally on this issue is undermined so long as we are not self-critical about our own status quo, and so long as we are silent on how we lag behind domestically. So you've asked me to speak to that a bit today, about how the issue of child and forced marriage plays out in the United States and what kinds of communities it impacts, how widespread it is. Well, actually, we found in our research and in our casework as a national legal services and advocacy organization serving immigrant survivors of gender-based violence that the impact is incredibly diverse. It seems no community is truly immune from these problems. We were initially focused in a 2011 first ever national survey that we piloted on immigrant communities, given our historical focus and our networks. And we did learn that victims came from families originating from at least 56 different countries and several different religious backgrounds. But we also learned that victims came from multi-generational American families, and that sense of this tremendously diverse impact on all levels, socioeconomic, ethnic, religious, cultural, has been underscored in all the work we've done since then across more than 35 states and in 20 foreign countries to which US victims have been taken abroad for forced marriages. The survey that we conducted in 2011 identified just what we see as the tip of the iceberg of the problem here. It documented as many as 3,000 forced marriage cases encountered by just 500 service providers, frontlines professionals like teachers, counselors, doctors, law enforcement, in just a 2-year period prior to the survey. And many of those cases involved girls under age 18. So I think that helps underscore that there is a problem in the US, that we are naive to think that it doesn't happen here, that isn't so serious when it does happen, or that it doesn't happen that often. And so I hope through forums like this we're able to change those kinds of assumptions. On child marriage specifically, about that same time in 2011 that we did our forced marriage survey, there was also a study, a national study published in a journal of pediatrics. And researchers there estimated that over 9.4 million US women had married at age 16 or younger, and that nearly 1.7 million had married at age 15 or younger. So emerging research like this 2011 study and others has also highlighted the many US-specific harms of child marriage, all those harms we think we may be immune from because we live in the US, and we don't. We aren't. Those include both more medical and mental health problems, both short and long term, 50% higher likelihood to drop out of high school, 1/4 less likely to continue to college, greater likelihood of future poverty, and increased vulnerability to violence. So I think, particularly when you assess that child marriages in the US end in divorce up to 80% of the time, parents who follow assumptions that marriage, for example, will provide security and stability to a pregnant teen are not only following sort of misguided and outdated assumptions, but we are now seeing that those assumptions are dangerous and actively harmful. So over the last year, we've also worked with a colleague organization to pull child marriage statistics from the health department records of all US states, and we've been floored, really floored by what we found. Tens of thousands of girls under age 18 have been married in recent years nationwide. So you take a recent 10-year period in a single state like Virginia, for example, and about 4,500 children under age 18 were married over that 10-year period. In a single recent year in a larger state like Texas, that same number has been achieved in a single year. The vast majority of children being married are girls, perhaps not surprisingly to this group. And in state after state, we're uncovering not only numbers like these, but disturbingly young ages at marriage, as young as 12, and startling age differences. Not only are most of these minors marrying adults, many times they are significantly older and sometimes decades older. So we don't have all the demographic information to tell us what all the stories are behind these child marriage statistics, but it's clear that there are many reasons that they reflect this kind of centuries-old and homegrown child marriage problem as much, or likely more so, than any immigrant-imported child marriage problem. For one thing, at the same time, we've been conducting a pretty in-depth analysis of all those state laws that permit child marriages still to happen in 2016 in the United States. As a general matter, as has been shared here, most states permit older minors, say 16 or 17-year-olds, to marry with parental consent alone, and mind you, with very scant evidence, not so much more than a signature on a form and no verification of who this person is standing before the clerk, perhaps. And many states only involve judges for younger ages, if at all. Some legal regimes are, in fact, holdovers from colonial days, and others hearken back to Roman law traditions, particularly those that differentiate in the ages based on gender. Many haven't been amended for decades, and very importantly, they are seemingly oblivious to a simultaneous development in child protection directions, like statutory rape laws that criminalize sex between individuals of certain ages or age differences as presumptively forced and non-consensual. So I especially appreciate my colleague panelists' note that some child marriages are not parent-forced, but instead partner-forced or predator-forced. And these are all very disturbing realizations, frankly, about the legal regimes that not only permit, but can actively facilitate forced and child marriages to happen.
Gracias, Jean. Definitivamente nos traes al debate la necesidad de recordar que esta problemática también existe en contextos de desarrollo, que es necesario conocer más sobre lo que está ocurriendo en contextos como Estados Unidos, evidentemente teniendo en cuenta el no estigmatizar a la población migrante. Es importante también lo que habla sobre el tema de la salud mental, cómo esto afecta a las niñas, también en contextos de desarrollo como es Estados Unidos, que también se evidencia cifras de abandono escolar relacionado al matrimonio, y algo sumamente relevante es que las asunciones existen también aquí en contextos de desarrollo y que también se identifica el matrimonio como una respuesta, una solución a la vida de las niñas. También nos recuerda que en este contexto podemos evidenciar que hay una diferencia de edad bastante importante, ¿no?, entre las niñas y los hombres con los que se casan, pero que todavía falta por tener más información al respecto. Y en ese sentido, Jen, me gustaría seguir profundizando un poco en la situación en Estados Unidos. Has adelantado alguna información sobre algunos estados dentro de Estados Unidos, pero nos gustaría saber si hay algunos específicos donde las leyes sobre la edad mínima de matrimonio y las excepciones son particularmente problemáticas, si tienes más información que añadir. Y también nos gustaría que nos contaras cuáles otras leyes afectan la capacidad de las menores de evitar o escapar matrimonios forzados o de protegerse de matrimonios abusivos.
Thank you. So yes, there are specific states where the laws on minimum marriage age are particularly problematic, and you refer to us as a developed country, but I would mention that with respect to these laws, we are very underdeveloped in those protections. We have actually just released a 50-state compilation of all the state laws with respect to their requirements for marriage, so you can dig deeper if you like in that guide. But the most problematic states, generally speaking, are those that permit pregnancy to be an express exception to the minimum marriage age laws, even though, as everyone has noted, pregnancy can be evidence of rape or statutory rape. Some of those states permit marriages of girls younger than those same girls could legally consent to sex outside of marriage. In those contexts, judge-approved marriages are actually judge-sanctioned statutory rapes. Other states that pose tremendous concerns are those that have absolutely no age floor below which a child cannot be married. So I want to repeat that because it was mentioned that, we found the ages as young as 12 documented. My colleague mentioned laws that expressly mention age 14, but frankly, over half of U.S. states, by statute, set no age floor for marriage so long as other exceptions are met, whether that's parental or judicial consent or the existence of a pregnancy. Other states that are tremendously concerning are those that involve only clerks in issuing judges and never clerks in issuing marriage licenses and never judges. Only 11 states, in fact, send all minors to a judge for permission to marry, and several of those states are some of the ones that have no age floors that apply, or they don't provide any meaningful guidance to those judges, or very problematic guidance in itself. For example, some states require absolutely no inquiry into the best interests of the minor. One state requires an inquiry into the best interests of society, not the particular minor. There may be other reasons that the guidance that's provided can be hardly counted on as a strong gatekeeper against the harms of child marriage or against forced marriages. So the list of these kinds of problematic legal regimes, ways in which they both fail to prioritize child protection and make it astonishingly easy, actually, to force children into marriages is really long, interwoven, and quite complicated. Honestly, every U.S. state could stand to make some improvements. Virginia, after a legislative campaign that we spearheaded this past year, is the only U.S. state currently that limits marriage to legal adults, individuals age 18 or older, or emancipated minors after a special court proceeding. So as we have mentioned before, I think the simplest and most straightforward approach to addressing the inherent child protection concerns and actually to empowering girls to make their own choices is to only permit them to marry when they are empowered in other ways legally with all those other rights they'd need to resist a marriage that they don't want to enter. And so you mentioned what are some of those other laws that can make it difficult in the U.S. to resist, prevent, or escape a forced marriage if you are a child. So whether an individual is 13 or 17, in the eyes of the law and depending on the state, as a minor, they have truly limited rights. They may face legal obstacles to running away, to staying with a friend or in a shelter, or even filing a protective order or for their own divorce. Marriage does not automatically emancipate a minor in some states, and in any event, emancipation means different things depending on the state. It could mean only that your parents have no further obligation to support you, not that you have all the legal rights of an adult. Married minors also often fall between the cracks of Child Protection Services protection or mandate, so that in Virginia, for example, CPS's mandate only extends to abuse by parents of children, not to abuse they may be experiencing from a spouse. So this complex of laws that may pose obstacles at every turn to a minor who wants to resist that marriage make us see effectively how child marriages can be more often presumed to be forced in a number of ways.
Gracias, Jen. Y en este contexto del que tú hablas, este entresijo de leyes complejas que afectan la capacidad y la autonomía de las niñas para finalizar estos matrimonios, en donde evidenciamos también, como tú dices, la disparidad que existe en algunos estados, donde la edad para casarse es menor que la edad de consentimiento. En este contexto donde tú dices que muchas veces el interés superior de la sociedad es más importante que el interés superior del niño o de la niña, en este caso de la niña, ¿cuáles son los principales obstáculos jurídicos para abordar el matrimonio infantil y forzado en ese contexto de los Estados Unidos?
I think the biggest obstacle is not legal, it's practical, it's awareness. It's that people don't know and they haven't been made to care yet. So that's one thing that we all need to work on together, and I'm glad to have this opportunity to do that. The biggest legal obstacles that we face are the federal-state division of authority in the U.S., and that constitutionally laws on family relations and child protection are state-driven. So the federal government cannot directly legislate a national minimum marriage age, for example, or as the UK has done, in one fell swoop, create a civil protection order for those seeking to prevent forced marriages. So that means that our campaign to end child marriage in the US is really 50 different state campaigns. That also means that there is a patchwork of legal regimes that leads to poor protection and very porous gaps and loopholes, many evasion opportunities. There was a recent headline about a father who drove his 14-year-old pregnant daughter 17 hours to another state to find a judge who would approve her marriage to the 24-year-old who had raped and impregnated her. So long as there is that opportunity, even as we pass better laws, tougher laws, laws that equate the age of marriage to the age of majority in one state, so long as we don't act across all states, we're leaving open those opportunities for exploitation and evasion. So that said, there truly is plenty of space for federal leadership in this issue, whether that's with regard to standard setting, like developing model statutes to set that minimum marriage age at the age of majority, challenging problematic elements like gender-based age differences, or even using that convening function that the US government has to pull together legislators to learn more about these issues and the problems with child marriage. There's also some good news in that there's growing momentum for change. So in addition to that new Virginia law, bills to address child marriage are pending, or we expect soon will be introduced in 5 other states. We've also fielded legislator and advocate interest in several other states. And we do know that while laws are only one piece of the puzzle, they really do matter, and they especially matter in a legalistic society like the United States. Texas, for example, when they raised in 2005 the age at which parental consent only was sufficient from 14 to 16, saw a precipitate drop in both the numbers of those who went to a judge to get permission under age 16 to marry and in the overall child marriage numbers. Similarly, Delaware, when they changed their laws in 2008 to send all minors before a judge and instituted more rigorous processes, saw a mere fraction of the former numbers resulting each year in child marriage. So I do think that there is reason to hope and also reason to push for more federal and concerted efforts, and certainly for empowering and supporting the efforts across every state to make a difference.
Muchas gracias. Definitivamente tenemos muchos desafíos también aquí en Estados Unidos y identificamos que todavía hay mucha necesidad de trabajar para fortalecer los mecanismos de protección hacia las niñas. De Estados Unidos viajamos hacia Brasil, donde quisiéramos que Giovanna Lauro nos hablara de cómo se manifiesta el matrimonio o la unión infantil en Brasil.
Thank you, Emma, and thanks to the organizer for the opportunity to be here today. I think something that Ginny was just saying now about how one of the biggest political obstacles is awareness, the lack of awareness about a phenomenon, applies quite well to Brazil. When we conducted the first ever research on the topic in Brazil about 3 years ago in collaboration with Plan International and the University of Pará and with support from the Ford Foundation, I think the main challenge that we faced at the very beginning was the fact that nobody of the key informants we talked to at the beginning of the research, that is child protection specialists in Brazil, development professionals and others, nobody saw child marriage as an issue. And frankly, I think some of them looked at us as we were wasting our time as researchers. And yet we had decided to look into the issue, starting from the data, starting from statistics. We have heard repeatedly today that we need more data, we need better data, and I fully agree with that. And yet, in many of the countries in Latin America, we have a little bit of data that already suggests how serious the situation is. For instance, just looking at Brazil, if we look at official data, federal and state level data from 2010, from the national census released by IBGE, the National Institute of Statistics in Brazil, we see that already according to those official data, out of all the respondents, about, I think, 88,000 reported having being in a informal or formal union that is cohabitating with a partner or a spouse between the age of 10 and 14. So this is official federal and state level data. And it's also related, obviously, to the fact that from a legislation perspective, there is no minimum age of marriage in case of pregnancy in Brazil. So that's why respondents could also say that they had been officially married between the age of 10 and 14. So if we look at this data, and also we look at the data that earlier this morning was presented, for instance, by Heather at Girls Not Brides, about the absolute numbers and also the prevalence of Brazil, we see that indeed the phenomenon is worth exploring, because regionally already Brazil, I think it's amongst the maybe 3 top countries in terms of prevalence. After the Dominican Republic and Nicaragua, I think Brazil has, as we saw, 36% of prevalence for women who reported being married, formally or informally, before the age of 18. But in terms of absolute numbers, the situation is even more worrisome, because we see that, again, as we saw this morning, Brazil ranks amongst the 4 countries in the world with the biggest absolute numbers of girls married before the age of 18, and similar statistics applied also to the numbers of girls married before the age of 15. The prevalence in Brazil is 11%. So 3 years ago, again, we conducted this research which looked at men's and women's attitudes around and practices around child marriage. We interviewed directly girls and adult men in a child marriage, and we also interviewed broader communities to get a sense of the norms around the practice. And we focused specifically in the north and northeast of Brazil, in the state of Pará and Maranhão, because according to the census, these are the states where not only the prevalence is the highest, but actually prevalence has not declined. What we found, very briefly, it echoes some of the findings that we've already heard this morning. We found that the practice is primarily informal. It happens in the form of cohabitation. We found that girls are indeed getting married, starting a family. It's strongly associated to the issue of teen pregnancy. And usually the male partner is older, but not as older as I would expect it, looking at the reality of child marriage in other continents. So usually the age difference is 10 to 15 years of age, which is still very relevant, because it still underlines significant differences in power relations within the couple, with all the impact that has then in the dynamics between the couple. And finally, something that we found that I think it's important to stress for a country like Brazil is that it's not just a phenomenon that happens amongst indigenous communities. It's a phenomenon that happens across society. Definitely the prevalence is likely to be higher amongst indigenous communities. We don't really know. We don't have studies about that. But again, our research did not focus specifically on minority communities, focus on urban sites, actually, in the state of Pará and Maranhão, and it found cases that were worth reporting and discussing. And finally, the very last point here, it's also maybe something about terminology. We found a lot of resistance talking about framing the issue as child marriage in Brazil, because also of the fact that a lot of even of civil society representatives feel that the girls who are in a union in Brazil are expressing to some extent, within the context of very discriminatory gender relations, but are expressing some level of agency. And so because of that, for instance, our report is titled Child and Adolescent Marriage, because again, in the Brazilian translation, we found that the focus on adolescence resonated much more and opened the room for an in-depth debate.
Gracias, Giovanna. Y definitivamente nos recuerdas la importancia de la terminología, que ese es un tema que definitivamente nos va a servir para el análisis posterior. En un país como Brasil, con alta prevalencia de matrimonios, uniones tempranas, uniones informales, tenemos diversas maneras de conceptualizarlo. Hay una necesidad urgente de que entre las organizaciones que estemos aquí sentadas podamos ponernos de acuerdo. Definitivamente está muy relacionado con el enfoque, la mirada que cada organización tenemos frente a la problemática del matrimonio de niñas, matrimonio forzado de niñas, desde una mirada más feminista, menos feminista, una mirada más desde la protección de la infancia. Eso es algo que invito para que podamos continuarlo en el debate. Has adelantado algunas informaciones sobre este estudio tan interesante que nos ha reunido como organizaciones. Y hay un concepto que para muchas organizaciones es sumamente importante, que es el concepto de la agencia de las niñas, como algo que evidenciamos que se distingue en las Américas diferente de otras regiones. ¿Podrías elaborar un poquito más este tema, por favor?
Sure, thank you. And I'm gonna be, I should say that I'm gonna oversimplify the concept of agency for the sake of time, but I think something that is very peculiar to the Latin American context is the way in which the concept of agency relates, in contrast actually to the ways in which we normally conceptualize the issue of child marriage. And again, oversimplifying, sometimes we tend to think about child marriage as a practice that it's imposed on girls. It's imposed on girls by their parents or by their relatives, girls who very often would rather stay in school, and that's very often the case. But if we look at specific contexts, such as many Latin American contexts, but also certain contexts in sub-Saharan Africa, we see that actually the picture is a bit more complex. What we found specifically in our research in Brazil is that, first of all, child marriage was not a norm recognized by anybody in the community. It was not a norm for the girls, it was not an acceptable norm for their families, it was not an acceptable norm for many men that we interviewed. And yet it took place, yet it happened. And it happened in a way that, for us, what was most surprising is that in many of the interviews that we conducted with married girls, marriage was phrased as a choice, as an expression of their own choice. And that, as I think, as development practitioners, pushes us to qualify and to think very carefully about the issue of agency, because we do want to put girls at the center of the programs preventing child marriage, and we do want to empower girls to make choices and decisions. But as we do that, we also need to ensure that we expand the choices available to girls. So that's a clear reminder of how important it is to focus on structural reforms when we deal with child marriage, not only around education, not only by ensuring that girls get to school, but actually improving, for instance, the quality of education. A lot of girls repeatedly said that a place to learn for them was the marriage. It wasn't the school. So we need to take that criticism into account in order to develop appropriate solutions. Similar, we also need to develop appropriate and meaningful employment opportunities, again, to expand the range of girls' aspirations beyond just getting married. Because realistically, many girls, again, reported that marriage was their best option in a very limited set of options, in a context of high urban insecurity, in a context of high financial insecurity. So from their perspective, getting married to an older man was much safer than being single and independent, or even getting married or being in a relationship with a young guy, a young boy their age, because according to the girls themselves, young boys, young men are usually vagabonds because they don't have jobs. And so that keeps us, I think that helps us remind of the importance of looking at the relational aspect of child marriage. Why is that the girls are choosing older men? We also need to keep in mind the other side of the marriage market, if we want to improve and if we want to foster healthy and meaningful relationships amongst young people. The second element, and the second and last element that I wanted to stress is that obviously as we focus on structural reforms, we also need to focus on normative change. But we need to be aware of what kind of normative change exactly is meaningful in which context. So as I said before, in the context, in the settings where we conducted the research in Brazil, child marriage was not a norm. It was not something that people expected young girls to be in, and it was something that it was highly considered, and yet it happened. So amongst the underlying norms that we identified as contributing to the practice happening is definitely the kind of constructions the constructions of sexuality that encourage older men to prefer younger girls because they are easier to control, they are easier to dominate, they're more submissive. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. If we want to truly prevent the practice in a sustainable way, we also need to work with young people from a comprehensive sexuality education perspective that takes into account the way in which young people construct sexuality. And this means working with young girls, but also working with young boys.
Muchas gracias, Giovanna. Y definitivamente es sumamente importante lo que nos traes al debate sobre la necesidad de que el visibilizar esta problemática tiene que ir acompañado de programas con calidad que permitan que las niñas estén en el centro y que fortalezcamos su autoestima, generemos espacios de empoderamiento y fortalezcan su agencia frente a estructuras sociales que son machistas, son patriarcales y que definitivamente solo les ofrecen una opción de vida frente a las múltiples opciones que realmente una niña en esa edad debería de tener. Desde luego, los hallazgos de este estudio son sumamente importantes y nos van a ayudar también a continuar la discusión. Terminaremos con Daniela Lillero, que pacientemente ha esperado hasta el final y no por ello no es importante, porque lo que nos va a contar ella definitivamente se centra también alrededor de esta fecha que hoy estamos celebrando, el 25 de noviembre. Together for Gays trabaja en el tema de violencia contra las niñas. Nos gustaría que nos contaras dónde entra el matrimonio infantil en este esquema.
Ok, bueno, buenas tardes a todos y todas. Yo lo tengo bien claro que soy la única cosa que les está haciendo esperar por el almuerzo, entonces trataré de ser breve. It's a real honor and pleasure to be with all of you here today. I'll try to be brief. I know I'm holding you from lunch. So let me just say a few words about Together for Girls. Most of you don't know who we are, and the reason is that although we are present in over 20 countries, we have not really been active in the region. We have primarily worked in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia. The only exception is Haiti, where we have worked, but I'm delighted to say that starting this year, we are active now in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, and are also in conversations about taking our model to Colombia. And we, as you well noted, focus on ending violence against children with a special gender lens. And the reason we do that is because of what you've heard over and over and over again today. These different forms of violence are all interrelated. So we look at sexual violence, physical violence, emotional violence, and the various kinds of issues that we've discussed today. We believe these issues are interconnected and solutions need to be interconnected. And we are a partnership. You know, we tend to think of problems vertically, but most of the time we have to solve them horizontally. And so we are a partnership that includes 5 UN agencies, the World Bank, UNICEF, WHO, PAHO, UNAIDS, UNFPA, UN Women, as well as the US government, the Canadian government, and several private sector actors. We believe that a problem of this magnitude cannot be solved by one actor or one sector. We all have to come together, and we each have something to contribute to that response. And the way our model works is we start with data. The CDC, the US Centers for Disease Control, has established over the last 6 years as part of our partnership violence against children surveys. They are national surveys that looked at physical, emotional, and sexual violence. We interview 13 to 24-year-olds. We now have data for 10% of the world's population. And we get a level of detail that no other survey can give us. Who's perpetrating the violence? Where is it happening? What puts you at risk? What are the associated consequences? We look at pregnancy, we look at HIV, we look at suicide ideation, a lot of the things we've talked about here today, because we, again, understand these things are connected. Once we have these national level surveys, it's really hard for governments to say what we've also heard today, which is, this doesn't really happen over here. It's really hard to deny those data. And we find that oftentimes, in the absence of data, people go with opinions. And I'm telling you, I say this over and over again. If we have data, let's look at data. If all we have are opinions, we're going to go with mine. And usually that's how most people respond. And so we really want to be fact-based, and we want to be looking at these data. Once we have these data, what we do is work to pull together these actors at national level. The government is always leading to develop a response. And I just want to point this out because when you work on these issues, you could feel like, oh my gosh, it's so bad. We've heard over and over again how bad it is. It seems insurmountable, but it is not. Change is possible, and we have seen that, and we know what works. And what works to prevent child marriage is usually what works to prevent other kinds of violence as well. We just launched with WHO and all the partners I mentioned, plus a bunch of others at a global level, something called Inspire, 7 strategies for ending violence against children. There are 7 things we know work to end violence against children, and most of them we've heard about today. Changing norms, changing laws, the different kinds of community interventions, and they can also serve to change child marriage. So to your earlier point, these things are absolutely interconnected, and we need to start thinking about them that way to be able to solve them. And I know you're going to ask me, and you don't have to ask me the next question. I'll just jump in because I know we're short for time, so I'll just wrap it up and say a few more things. Just to give you a sense of the data we're able to gather through these surveys, I want to give you some statistics from Haiti. We found in Haiti that 1 in 4 girls under the age of 18 had experienced sexual violence. 1 in 4. 20% of them were under 13. And this is forced completed sex. The other thing we found, and we find over and over again in all of these surveys, is that relationships are risky for girls. Not just marriage, boyfriends, any kind of intimate partner relationship. And that the violence starts very, very, very young. We found in Haiti that about 35% of the perpetrators of sexual violence, whether you were married or not, was what someone called a boyfriend or a partner. And most of the time, they're between 5 and 15 years older than you are, than the girls are. In a country like Zimbabwe, we found it's close to 78% of the violence, sexual violence, is perpetrated by intimate partners. So relationships are risky for girls. And then, of course, the other thing we find is all the consequences. I mean, we have found huge associations with HIV, pregnancy. For example, in Haiti, 30% of the girls that experienced the sexual violence said that they got pregnant as a result of that. So as we're thinking about all of these interconnected issues, it's important to understand how in some cases one comes first, in other cases the other one comes first, and how we need to intervene, understanding the data for that particular country. And then I think the last thing that we've really found is that a lot of this comes from the same place, and I'm repeating myself, you've heard this over and over again. Gender inequality, the norms that devalue and put girls and women at a disadvantage to boys and men, actually are at the root of all of these kinds of violence that we're seeing. So in order to really, create deep and lasting change, we have to go to the root of the problem. And I am a firm believer that we will only be able to do that when we work across sectors and in partnership. So I'll close with that. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Danila. Definitivamente tu exposición es muy pertinente para el cierre de esta mesa, la necesidad de que identifiquemos maneras de colaborar. Felicitarte por el trabajo que estáis realizando, estoy deseando conocer más y son insumos con todos los que nos han expuesto las demás panelistas que nos van a permitir salir de aquí realmente con estrategias coordinadas. Yo me permito quitarme el vestido de moderadora rápidamente antes de cerrar y decir que para mí ha sido un honor desde Plan Internacional estar en este espacio con mujeres poderosas que están haciendo un trabajo increíble con sus equipos. Definitivamente estamos muy comprometidos como organización a través del movimiento por ser niña, de encontrar respuestas programáticas junto con todas las organizaciones que están sentadas aquí que permitan reducir y eliminar el matrimonio de niñas forzado, identificar terminologías conjuntas, reconocer que la juventud tiene un rol muy importante y tenemos que ser muy cautelosos y cautelosas en no interferir en su agenda también de los derechos sexuales reproductivos. Todas lo habéis destacado aquí, el tema de las masculinidades positivas es urgente, necesitamos trabajar con niños desde la más temprana edad, además que con las niñas, desde Plan Internacional lo estamos haciendo y vamos a tener tiempo para compartir esto. Y cerraré también diciendo que, que estamos a la disposición de encontrar estos espacios y que el movimiento por ser niña busca que las niñas aprendan, lideren, decidan y prosperen, siempre las niñas en el centro para erradicar el matrimonio forzado de niñas. Así que muchísimas gracias y pues todavía nos queda mucho trabajo esta tarde.